In the quiet town of Cedarville, Illinois, on September 6, 1860, Jane Addams was born into a world that would soon demand the best of her calm, compassionate nature. Her life, unfolding in the shifting landscapes of the 19th and 20th centuries, would become a quiet testament to the power of service, peace, and social reform. As a young woman, Jane sought not only to understand the struggles of others, but to ease them through the creation of spaces dedicated to care, education, and mutual respect. In the heart of Chicago, she would build Hull House, a settlement house that became a beacon of hope for immigrants, women, and the marginalized in society. Through her steadfast work, Jane Addams shaped a new path for social work, peace advocacy, and women's rights. Her influence, though often subtle and quiet, reached across nations, touching generations of people dedicated to building a fairer world. Jane's journey was not one of rapid change or dramatic upheaval, but rather a steady unfolding of compassion and conviction that would leave a lasting legacy. As you settle in, let the gentle flow of her story guide you through the peaceful cadence of her life. If this story resonates with you, feel free to like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. But for now, simply listen as Jane Addams' life unfolds slowly and steadily in the quiet rhythm of time. In the quiet town of Cedarville, Illinois, Jane Addams was born to Herman and Pauline Addams in 1860. Cedarville, a small rural community nestled in the northern part of the state, was far from the bustling cities where social reform movements were beginning to take shape. It was here, amidst the gentle rhythms of country life, that Jane's early years would unfold. But even in this tranquil environment, the seeds of compassion and social responsibility were quietly being planted. Her father, Herman, was a prosperous businessman and Illinois state senator. He was a man of integrity, known for his strong character and his commitment to public service. His influence on Jane was profound. He encouraged her curiosity, inspired her with his ideas about service to others, and instilled in her the belief that every individual had a duty to contribute to the well-being of society. Jane's relationship with her father was an essential part of her childhood, and his untimely death when she was just 2 years old left a lasting impact on her. The loss of her father would shape much of Jane's worldview, marking the beginning of a life defined by resilience and a strong sense of responsibility. Her mother, Pauline, became the cornerstone of Jane's upbringing. After Herman's death, Pauline managed the family estate and took on the dual role of nurturing her daughters. Her steady presence and quiet strength guided Jane as she navigated the world without the guidance of her father. Although Jane's mother was not publicly active in social causes, her influence on Jane was profound. Pauline emphasized the importance of education and moral character, encouraging her daughter to think critically about the world around her. Though Jane's early life in Cedarville was marked by love and support, it was also characterized by the weight of personal loss. The absence of her father left a void that would never fully be filled, but it also instilled in Jane a sense of purpose that would shape her future. It is in this period of her childhood, surrounded by the quiet landscape of Cedarville, that Jane began to develop a deep sense of empathy for those who experienced loss and hardship. As Jane grew older, she began her formal education at the local school in Cedarville. The school, though small, was a place where Jane's intellectual curiosity was nurtured. Her teachers recognized her potential and encouraged her to pursue her studies with passion. Despite the limited educational opportunities in rural Illinois, Jane excelled in her studies, particularly in subjects that required critical thinking and reflection. Her aptitude for reading and writing would lay the foundation for her future career as an advocate and writer. However, Cedarville's small-town environment offered little in terms of intellectual stimulation, and Jane often found herself yearning for broader horizons. Her inner world, filled with dreams of greater purpose, was far larger than the quiet town where she spent her childhood. It was clear that Jane's future would not be confined to the borders of Cedarville. But in these formative years, the lessons of hard work, perseverance, and service to others would shape her identity in ways that would continue to guide her throughout her life. By the time Jane reached her teenage years, her mother decided that it was time for Jane to experience life beyond Cedarville. In 1877, she enrolled at the Rockford Female Seminary in Rockford, Illinois, a progressive institution that offered more advanced academic training for women. This was a pivotal moment in Jane's life. It marked the beginning of her academic journey, one that would expose her to new ideas and open her eyes to the larger social issues affecting the world. At Rockford, Jane encountered a world very different from the one she'd known in Cedarville. The seminary provided a challenging academic environment where Jane began to grapple with ideas of social responsibility and gender equality. It was here that Jane would come into contact with progressive ideas that would define her later years. She found herself drawn to the study of social issues and the philosophy of helping others. The seeds of her future social work were planted during her time at Rockford, where she was exposed to a broader intellectual landscape and began to see the world beyond her small-town upbringing. Although her time in Cedarville was relatively quiet, it was foundational in shaping Jane's character. The lessons she learned in her early years, the importance of community, the value of education, and the necessity of empathy, would stay with her throughout her life. As Jane left Cedarville and moved on to Rockford, she carried these lessons with her, ready to take on the larger world that awaited her. Her early life, though marked by personal loss and small-town simplicity, laid the foundation for her future endeavours. In the quiet spaces of Cedarville, Jane Addams developed a deep understanding of the human condition, one that would drive her to serve others and to create lasting change. The experiences of her youth, both the moments of joy and the moments of sorrow, shaped the woman she would become. A woman who would devote her life to improving the lives of others and to fostering a more compassionate society. In 1877, at the age of 17, Jane Addams left the comforting confines of Cedarville and made her way to the Rockford Female Seminary in Rockford, Illinois. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would expose her to the intellectual challenges and progressive ideas that would shape her future work. The seminary was a progressive institution for young women, offering an education that focused on critical thinking, ethics, and social responsibility. Although her education there was formal and rooted in the academic traditions of the time, it also offered Jane a broader view of the world. At Rockford, Jane encountered ideas that would inspire her lifelong commitment to social reform. The curriculum emphasized not just the traditional subjects of literature and history, but also the importance of moral philosophy and public service. It was at Rockford that Jane was introduced to the works of social reformers and thinkers, and she began to grapple with the social issues of her time. Her mind, once shaped by the quiet rhythms of Cedarville, was now expanding to include the complexities of urbanization, industrialization, and the plight of the poor. During her time at the seminary, Jane became increasingly interested in the intellectual ideas that would influence her work later in life. She was particularly drawn to the idea of social responsibility, how individuals, especially those with privilege, could work to address the social inequities around them. It was here that she first began to understand the importance of not just helping others on an individual level, but seeking systemic changes that would lift entire communities out of poverty and despair. Rockford also marked a significant shift in Jane's personal perspective. Raised in a household that valued both intellectual growth and social duty, Jane began to see that her calling might lie not in the traditional roles available to women at the time, but in the service of others. The possibilities for women in the public sphere were growing during this period, and Jane began to question the limitations society had placed on her gender. The intellectual freedom she experienced at Rockford emboldened her, and she became more determined to pursue a life that would transcend traditional female roles of the time. Her time at Rockford was also marked by personal struggle. Jane was often torn between the expectations of her family and the academic world that encouraged her to challenge those very expectations. She felt a deep sense of obligation to her family, who had supported her education, but at the same time she was drawn to a path that seemed far removed from the conventional roles that women were expected to fill. She sought a life of purpose and service, not just domesticity. The internal conflict she experienced at Rockford was compounded by the society's expectations for women. At the time, a woman's role was often confined to the domestic sphere: marriage, motherhood, and keeping house. This societal norm was in stark contrast to Jane's growing realization that she could have a significant impact on the world beyond her home. She began to see education as a tool for not just personal advancement, but for social change. Her experiences at Rockford would be the foundation for her later advocacy for women's rights and her efforts to open doors for women in the public and political spheres. While her time at Rockford helped Jane hone her intellectual abilities, it also forced her to confront the limitations imposed upon her gender. The experience left an indelible mark on her, one that would shape not just her personal life, but also her public service efforts. It was at Rockford that she first began to understand that her future might lie not in the traditional roles of wife and mother, but in something far broader, working to transform society and address the social issues that were too often ignored. Upon graduation in 1881, Jane faced a critical decision: whether to follow the traditional path for women of her time, or to pursue a life that could challenge societal norms and make a lasting impact. The conventional paths before her, marriage, family, and domesticity, seemed increasingly narrow and unappealing. Jane longed for something deeper, something that would allow her to contribute to the betterment of society in a more significant way. She had been exposed to a world of ideas at Rockford that had wakened something inside her, a calling to serve, to help others, and to be part of the solution to the pressing social issues of her time. But the path Jane would eventually choose was not one without its struggles. She was part of a generation of women who were beginning to question their roles in society, but the idea of women in public service was still a radical one. Jane knew that if she was to pursue this calling, she would have to overcome the limitations placed on women and forge a path that was uniquely her own. Her time at Rockford prepared her for this challenge. The academic training she received, combined with the exposure to progressive social ideas, gave her the tools she would need to navigate a world that was not ready for women to occupy the spaces of public influence. But Jane was undeterred. The foundation laid at Rockford provided her with both the intellectual tools and the moral clarity to pursue a life dedicated to social reform. Her intellectual development during this period was crucial to her later success. Though Jane had been raised in a home that encouraged intellectual curiosity, it was at Rockford that her worldview began to shift from one of individual responsibility to a broader, more systemic understanding of social injustice. The education she received, combined with the personal struggles she faced, set her on the path to becoming one of the most influential social reformers of her time. Her time at Rockford helped solidify her sense of purpose, and it gave her the courage to seek a life that would challenge the boundaries of what was expected of women in the late 19th century. After graduating from Rockford Female Seminary in 1881, Jane Addams found herself at a crossroads. Although she'd completed her education, she was unsure of the path ahead. The conventional route for women at the time was marriage and motherhood. Yet Jane's ambitions went far beyond these traditional roles. She longed to find a way to make a meaningful contribution to society, to play a part in improving the lives of those in need. This desire for purpose and service would shape the trajectory of her life. In 1882, Jane made the decision to travel to Europe. For a young woman of her time, it was an ambitious choice, one that reflected both a thirst for knowledge and a longing to experience the world beyond the confines of her small-town upbringing. The journey was not just a way for Jane to see the world, but also a time for personal reflection. during her travels she sought inspiration for the future, and more importantly, a way to align her desire to help others with practical action. While in Europe, Jane visited a number of progressive social institutions, including settlement houses that were just beginning to take root in major cities. One of the most significant experiences during this time was her visit to Toynbee Hall in London, a pioneering settlement house founded by social reformer Samuel Barnett in 1884. At Toynbee Hall, middle-class men and women lived alongside the poor, offering social services, education and assistance to those in need. The aim was not just to provide charity but to create opportunities for the poor to improve their circumstances by fostering a sense of community and self-respect. At Toynbee Hall, Jane saw the model of social work that would become her life's mission. The idea of a settlement house as a space for mutual learning, where those who had privilege could work alongside the marginalized to create a better society, resonated deeply with her. It was in this atmosphere of collaboration and service that Jane saw how society could be transformed through collective action. The visit to Toynbee Hall stirred something within her, igniting a vision for a similar institution that could meet the needs of the poor in her own country. The inspiration Jane gained from Toynbee Hall would have a lasting impact on her. She saw firsthand how communities could be empowered, not just by charity, but by the active involvement of those who were better off. She also realized the importance of education and vocational training in helping individuals escape poverty. The settlement house model, which provided a safe haven for immigrants and poor workers, could be the answer to the social problems Jane had long observed, but felt powerless to address. It was a solution grounded in the values of mutual respect, empathy and service. Values that Jane held dear. After her travels in Europe, Jane returned to the United States with a clear vision of what her future could look like. She knew that she had to create something like Toynbee Hall in America, but the challenge was where to establish it and how to make it work. Chicago, with its booming immigrant population and growing industrial workforce, seemed the perfect place to bring her vision to life. In 1889, with her mind made up, Jane set her sights on founding Hull House, a settlement house in the heart of Chicago's immigrant district. The area was a stark contrast to the prosperous neighborhoods of the city. It was an industrial hub, filled with working-class families, many of them recent immigrants who had come to America in search of better opportunities. These immigrants faced difficult living conditions, overcrowded tenements, long working hours, and little access to education or health care. Jane saw in these struggles the same issues she had witnessed in her own country, but now she had the vision and the tools to make a difference. With the help of her friend Ellen Gates Starr, Jane secured a large old house on Halsted Street. Hull House was modest at first, but it was a place where women and men from all walks of life could come together to share ideas, learn, and support each other. Jane's approach was different from that of other social reformers of the time. Rather than simply offering charity, she sought to create an environment where both the privileged and the poor could work together to improve their lives. This idea of shared responsibility, where each person could contribute in their own way, was central to the mission of Hull House. Hull House was designed to be a place of learning and growth. Jane believed that through education, individuals could lift themselves out of poverty. She began offering classes in English, citizenship and vocational training, as well as hosting lectures and discussions on various social issues. These programs were not just aimed at helping immigrants assimilate into American society, but at empowering them to become active participants in their communities. Hull House became a center of intellectual and social activity, where people could share ideas and find solutions to the problems they faced. As Hull House grew, so did Jane's reputation as a leader in social reform. She began to attract like-minded individuals who shared her vision of a more just society. Together they expanded the services offered at Hull House, adding a kindergarten, a library, a gymnasium and a clinic. It became clear that Jane's idea of a settlement house was not just an experiment, but a model for social change. Hull House was proof that communities could be transformed through education, mutual respect, and collaboration. The founding of Hull House was a turning point in Jane Addams' life. It marked the beginning of a long and successful career in social reform, one that would make her one of the most important figures in American social work and one of the leading voices for peace and women's rights. Hull House would become her life's work, a place where her vision for a more just society could take root and grow. In 1889, Jane Addams took the bold step of founding Hull House in the heart of Chicago's crowded immigrant district. The neighborhood was one of the most impoverished in the city, filled with working-class families, many of whom had come to America in search of a better life. But for many, the reality was far harsher than the promise of opportunity. The area was plagued by overcrowded tenements, poor sanitation, long work hours, and a lack of basic services. Immigrants from Italy, Poland, Germany, and other countries were often trapped in difficult circumstances, struggling to find work and make a living. Hull House was born out of Jane's desire to address the deep social inequities she had witnessed in her travels and research. Her vision was clear. She wanted to create a place where both the privileged and the poor could come together, work alongside each other, and foster mutual understanding and respect. She understood that social reform needed more than charity. It needed the involvement of all people, regardless of their social class. This shared responsibility, where everyone contributed to improving the community, was at the heart of Hull House's mission. Hull House was housed in a large old mansion that had been donated to Jane Addams by a wealthy philanthropist. Located at 800 Halsted Street, the house became a centre for social reform, offering a range of services to the immigrant families living in the area. These services were designed not just to provide temporary relief, but to empower individuals to improve their own lives. Jane and her colleagues at Hull House sought to teach immigrants skills that would help them navigate their new lives in America and to provide the tools for self-sufficiency. One of the first programs that Jane introduced was a kindergarten for children. At the time, many working-class families could not afford to send their children to school, and the children were often left to roam the streets, uneducated and vulnerable. The kindergarten at Hull House was a pioneering effort in early childhood education, and it provided a safe space where children could receive an education and develop essential skills. This program also served as an entry point for many families to access the other services Hull House offered. As Hull House grew, Jane and her colleagues expanded their programs to meet the needs of the diverse immigrant community. They offered classes in English, citizenship, and vocational training, which were designed to help immigrants integrate into American society and improve their prospects. These classes were not just about teaching new skills, but also about fostering a sense of self-worth and dignity. The goal was to empower individuals to take control of their lives and create a better future for themselves and their families. In addition to educational programs, Hull House also offered social services such as healthcare and legal assistance. Jane believed that social reform needed to address the root causes of poverty, not just the symptoms. By providing practical help to immigrants, whether through medical care or legal advice, Hull House became a lifeline for many who were otherwise ignored by the broader society. Jane's vision was becoming a reality, and Hull House was rapidly growing into a hub of social change. Throughout these early years, Jane faced numerous challenges. Many in the wealthy, established class looked down on her work, believing that the poor were simply lazy or unworthy of help. Others were critical of Jane's decision to live in the same neighborhood as the immigrants she sought to help, viewing it as inappropriate for a woman of her social standing. But Jane was undeterred. She believed that living alongside the people she was trying to help allowed her to understand their struggles more deeply and to better address their needs. Despite the criticisms, Hull House thrived. As Jane worked tirelessly to build the settlement house into a vital resource for the community, Her influence continued to grow. She began to attract a diverse group of reformers, activists and volunteers, many of whom shared her vision for a more just society. Hull House became a place where ideas about social justice could be tested and put into action, and its success inspired the creation of other settlement houses in cities across the United States. Jane Addams' commitment to Hull House was all-consuming. She poured her energy into the settlement, constantly expanding its programs and services to meet the needs of the community. She used her growing influence to push for policy reforms that would improve living conditions for the poor, particularly for women and children. Her work at Hull House was not just about providing immediate relief, but about addressing the systemic issues that led to poverty and inequality. The work at Hull House was also a deeply personal journey for Jane. She found fulfillment not in traditional roles, but in her ability to help others, to be part of a movement that sought to create lasting social change. Hull House became her home, her mission, and her life's work. It was here that Jane found her true calling, and it was through Hull House that she would go on to have a profound impact on American society. Hull House was more than just a settlement house. It was a living, breathing embodiment of Jane Addams' vision for a better world. It was a place where people of all backgrounds could come together, share their experiences and work toward a common goal. Over the years, Hull House would grow into one of the most influential social reform organizations in the country, and Jane Addams would become one of the leading voices in the fight for social justice. As Hull House took root in Chicago's immigrant community, its impact expanded beyond the walls of the settlement house. Jane Addams' dedication to improving the lives of the poor and marginalized fueled her efforts to address systemic social issues in broader, more transformative ways. The early years of Hull House were just the beginning of what would become a decades-long journey in social reform. Jane's work was not limited to providing direct services to immigrants. It evolved into advocacy, activism, and intellectual leadership. By the early 1890s, Hull House had grown into a bustling centre for social reform. The settlement house provided a wide range of services: English language classes, job training, educational programs for children, health care, and even cultural activities. But Jane's vision extended beyond simply helping individuals improve their immediate circumstances. She saw the power of community as a catalyst for lasting change, and she began to focus on how to address the root causes of poverty and social inequality. One of the most important developments during this period was Jane's growing engagement with local and national politics. Jane understood that to create meaningful change, it wasn't enough to merely provide services. She needed to work on a broader level to influence policy and shape the social landscape. In 1893, she helped form the Chicago Women's Club, a group dedicated to women's political and social activism. She also became involved in the broader social reform movement that was gaining momentum in the United States. Her political and social advocacy was rooted in a deep sense of empathy and a desire to improve the lives of all people, regardless of their background. Jane believed that social justice could only be achieved if the voices of the marginalized were heard and valued. She tirelessly worked to elevate the voices of women, immigrants, and working-class people, advocating for their rights and fighting for policies that would improve their lives. Her involvement in social reform led her to be part of several influential organizations, including the National Women's Trade Union League, which fought for workers' rights, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which campaigned for racial equality. Throughout the 1890s, Hull House became a beacon for social reformers and activists from across the country. The settlement house was not just a place for direct service, but also a hub for intellectual discussion and political action. Jane invited leaders from a wide range of social reform movements to speak at Hull House, and the settlement house hosted numerous lectures, workshops, and conferences on topics such as labor rights, women's suffrage, and education reform. Hull House became a space where activists, academics, and politicians could come together to exchange ideas and strategize about how to bring about social change. In 1899, Jane and her colleagues at Hull House launched a groundbreaking initiative, the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy. The school aimed to train social workers, equipping them with the knowledge and skills needed to address the social issues they encountered in their work. The school's curriculum focused on the practical aspects of social work, emphasizing the importance of understanding the lives and needs of the people being served. The Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy helped to establish social work as a formal profession, and it contributed to the development of a new generation of social reformers dedicated to improving society. Jane's influence continued to grow throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s. She was increasingly recognized as a leader in the social reform movement, both in Chicago and across the country. Her work was widely admired, and she was invited to speak at conferences and gatherings of reformers and activists. Her intellectual and political engagement helped to elevate social work and the settlement house movement into the mainstream of American society. Despite her growing influence, Jane remained grounded in the day-to-day work of Hull House. She continued to live in the settlement house, working directly with the people who came to Hull House for help. Her connection to the community was personal and genuine, and she believed that it was essential to live alongside the people she was trying to help. This commitment to the people of Hull House was a central aspect of her leadership, and it helped to inspire others to get involved in the settlement house movement. By 1900, Hull House had become one of the most influential social reform institutions in the United States. Jane's work was having a profound impact on the lives of the poor, particularly women and children. The settlement house provided a space for immigrants to learn new skills, improve their health, and find support in a new and often difficult environment. Hull House's success was a testament to Jane's vision, and it inspired the establishment of other settlement houses in cities across the United States and beyond. The expansion of Hull House and Jane Addams' growing influence during the 1890s marked a critical period in her life and in the history of social reform in America. Hull House became not just a place of service, but a center of intellectual and political action. Jane's belief in the power of community education and political activism helped to shape the social landscape of the time, and her work continues to resonate in the fields of social work, women's rights, and social justice today. As the turn of the century approached, Jane Addams found herself at the heart of a growing movement for labor rights, social justice, and women's suffrage. By this time, Hull House had become more than just a settlement house. It had evolved into a powerful center of activism and social reform. Jane's work was now intertwined with efforts to improve the lives of workers, particularly those in the industrial sector, where dangerous conditions and long hours were common. She recognized that the struggles of working-class families were inseparable from the broader issues of poverty and inequality. One of Jane's central goals was to fight for labor rights and better working conditions, especially for women and children. The Industrial Revolution had brought about significant economic growth, but it had also led to the exploitation of workers, particularly in factories and mills. Children worked long hours in hazardous conditions, and many women labored in factories for meager wages. Jane was deeply moved by the plight of these workers, and she became a vocal advocate for their rights. Her efforts were not only about improving conditions, but also about asserting the dignity of work and the importance of labor as a path to self-sufficiency. In the early 1900s, Jane joined forces with other prominent reformers to push for labor laws that would regulate working hours, improve safety conditions, and eliminate child labor. She worked closely with the Women's Trade Union League, an organization dedicated to advancing the rights of female workers. Through this partnership, Jane advocated for the establishment of minimum wage laws, the regulation of factory conditions, and the improvement of health and safety standards. She believed that fair labour practices were essential to the creation of a just society, and she used her platform at Hull House to mobilise public opinion in favour of these reforms. One of the key moments in Jane's advocacy for labour rights came in 1909, when she supported a strike by workers at the Chicago Garment District. Thousands of workers, many of them women, went on strike to protest poor wages and working conditions. Jane's involvement in the strike was a turning point in her career as an activist. She did not just provide moral support, she was actively involved in organising and advocating for the workers. Her participation in the strike helped to bring attention to the poor conditions in the garment industry and put pressure on the city's politicians to pass labour laws that would benefit workers. In addition to her work on labour rights, Jane was also a strong advocate for women's suffrage. She believed that women's voices were crucial to creating a more just society and that political participation was an essential right. In the early 1900s, the women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum across the United States, and Jane became one of its leading voices. She saw voting as a fundamental right that would give women the power to influence policy and push for social reforms that would improve the lives of women and families. Her commitment to suffrage was not just about securing the vote for women, but about empowering women to take an active role in shaping society. She believed that women's involvement in politics would lead to a more compassionate and just world. To this end, Jane worked tirelessly to promote suffrage at Hull House and beyond. She organised events, gave speeches, and lobbied political leaders in support of women's right to vote. Her efforts helped to bring the issue of suffrage to the forefront of the national political agenda, and she became a prominent figure in the movement for women's rights. In addition to her work on labour rights and suffrage, Jane was also an advocate for a range of social reforms, including the expansion of public education, the improvement of housing conditions, and the establishment of social welfare programs. She believed that these reforms were essential to creating a more equitable society, one in which all people had the opportunity to improve their circumstances and contribute to the common good. Jane's advocacy for social justice was deeply rooted in her personal values. She believed in the power of education, the importance of compassion, and the necessity of collective action. Her work was driven by a sense of moral duty to address the suffering she witnessed in the lives of the poor, the exploited, and the marginalized. Hull House served as the base for her activism, providing a platform where she could connect with other reformers, share ideas, and mobilize support for her causes. Throughout this period, Jane faced significant opposition from those who resisted change. Many of the wealthy elites in Chicago viewed her as a radical, and they were critical of her efforts to challenge the status quo. But Jane was undeterred. She was resolute in her belief that social justice was not just an ideal, but a practical goal that could be achieved through the efforts of individuals and communities working together. Her advocacy for labour rights, women's suffrage, and social reform helped to build a foundation for the progressive era, a time of significant social and political change in the United States. Jane was one of the leading figures in the movement, and her influence extended far beyond Chicago. Her work inspired a new generation of activists and social workers who were committed to addressing the root causes of inequality and creating a more just society. By 1910, Jane Addams had become a household name, known not only for her work at Hull House, but for her national advocacy on behalf of workers, women, and immigrants. She had proven that social reform was possible and that change could be achieved through collective action, education, and activism. Her impact on labour rights, women's rights, and social justice was profound, and her legacy as a social reformer would continue to inspire future generations. When World War I broke out in 1914, Jane Addams found herself at a crossroads. Having spent much of her life advocating for social justice and equality, she believed passionately in the power of diplomacy and peaceful resolution of conflicts. The outbreak of the war deeply troubled her, and she felt compelled to speak out against it. Addams was firmly committed to the idea that war was not the answer to resolving international disputes. As a pacifist, she was convinced that war caused immeasurable harm to both individuals and society as a whole, and she believed that peace should be pursued at all costs. In 1915, Jane became the president of the Women's Peace Party, an organization dedicated to preventing the war from spreading and seeking peaceful alternatives. At the time, the Women's Peace Party was one of the few organizations advocating for non-violent solutions in a world increasingly consumed by the desire for military dominance. Jane's involvement in the peace movement was not a new development, but the war gave her a renewed sense of urgency in her quest for diplomacy. Jane's pacifist stance was not without its challenges. She faced widespread criticism for her views, especially from those who believed that the United States should join the Allies in the fight against the Central Powers. Many saw her as unpatriotic, and she was often accused of being a traitor for opposing the war. Yet, despite the mounting public pressure, Jane remained resolute. She continued to call for peace, organizing anti-war demonstrations, writing letters, and making speeches to advocate for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Her advocacy for peace during World War I was deeply rooted in her belief in the sanctity of human life. Jane was acutely aware of the devastating toll war took on both soldiers and civilians, and she believed that the consequences of war were far-reaching and destructive. In her view, the lives lost in combat were not just numbers on a page. They represented individual human beings, families and communities shattered by violence. She saw the war as a failure of humanity, a reflection of the inability of nations to resolve their differences without resorting to bloodshed. In addition to her work with the Women's Peace Party, Jane became involved in the International Congress of Women, which convened in The Hague in 1915. The goal of the Congress was to bring together women from various countries to discuss how to prevent the war and establish a lasting peace. Jane attended the Congress and worked alongside other women's rights activists and pacifists to develop strategies for peace. At the Congress, she called for a peace without victory, a settlement in which no nation would emerge triumphant, but all nations would work together for mutual understanding and reconciliation. Although her efforts at The Hague were not immediately successful in stopping the war, they were an important step in the broader movement for global peace. Jane's work at the Congress helped to establish the groundwork for future peace initiatives, and it demonstrated the power of women in shaping the political landscape. The idea of women's involvement in international diplomacy was radical at the time, but Jane's participation in The Hague was a testament to her unwavering belief that peace was possible, and that women had a crucial role to play in achieving it. As the war raged on, Jane's pacifist stance continued to garner attention. She wrote extensively about the horrors of war, its devastating effects on society, and the need for global cooperation to prevent future conflicts. She argued that the war was a symptom of deeper issues: inequality, nationalism, and the militarization of societies, and that only through addressing these root causes could lasting peace be achieved. Jane's advocacy for peace was a natural extension of her earlier work in social reform, as she believed that social justice and peace were inextricably linked. In 1919, following the end of the war, Jane's efforts in the peace movement were recognized on a global scale. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work advocating for peace during the war. The award was a testament to the tireless work she'd done to promote diplomacy, disarmament, and international cooperation. It was a recognition of her steadfast commitment to the principles of peace and nonviolence, principles she had championed throughout her career. The Nobel Peace Prize was a significant achievement for Jane, but it also represented the culmination of years of hard work, dedication, and belief in the power of peace. She did not view the award as an end in itself, but as a stepping stone in the ongoing struggle for peace and justice. Despite the recognition, Jane remained humble, continuing her work with the same commitment to social change and activism that had defined her career. The outbreak of World War I had a profound impact on Jane Addams. It tested her convictions, forced her to stand firm in the face of public criticism, and drove her to redouble her efforts to promote peace. Her work during this period solidified her status as one of the leading voices for peace and diplomacy in the early 20th century. Though the war ended in 1918, Jane's efforts continued to resonate long after, and her legacy as a pacifist and social reformer continues to inspire those who seek to create a more just and peaceful world. The end of World War I marked a new chapter not only in the history of the world, but also in Jane Addams' life. Having witnessed the devastation caused by the war, and having played a pivotal role in the peace movement, Jane returned to her work with a renewed sense of urgency. The peace she had long advocated for had come at a great cost, and now she focused her efforts on rebuilding societies ravaged by conflict, addressing the aftermath of the war, and ensuring that the wounds of violence would not resurface in future. Generations. In the post-war era, Jane remained deeply involved in social reform, continuing her work at Hull House and expanding her efforts into international realms. In the wake of the war, the world was facing numerous challenges: economic instability, the rise of fascism, labour unrest, and ongoing social inequality. Jane believed that the work she'd been doing at Hull House, helping immigrants, supporting labour rights, and promoting social justice, was even more crucial in the context of the changing world. During the 1920s, Jane turned her attention to the social issues that were exacerbated by the war. She was especially concerned with the plight of women and children who'd been disproportionately affected by the war. Women had gained new freedoms and roles during the conflict, but they were often left to face the challenges of reintegration into a society that was still largely governed by traditional gender roles. Jane understood that the social progress women had made during the war was fragile, and that it needed to be protected and nurtured in the post-war years. She also continued her advocacy for labour rights, particularly focusing on the conditions of women workers. The 1920s were a time of rapid industrialization and urbanization, but the workers who powered these changes were often subjected to dangerous working conditions and low wages. Jane's commitment to improving the lives of these workers remained strong, and she continued to call for the regulation of labour practices and for better protections for women and children in the workplace. Hull House became a critical space for organising and educating working women, many of whom had been left out of the benefits of economic growth. As the decade unfolded, Jane was also concerned with the growing tide of nationalism and xenophobia that was sweeping across Europe and starting to make its way into the United States. The rise of fascism and authoritarian regimes in Europe deeply troubled Jane, who believed that such ideologies were fundamentally at odds with the principles of democracy and human rights. She was an outspoken critic of militarism and authoritarianism, continuing her advocacy for peace and social justice. Her work in these areas was particularly important in light of the increasing threat of global instability, which she saw as a direct consequence of the failure of governments to prioritize diplomacy and cooperation. During the 1920s, Jane was also instrumental in establishing the National League of Women Voters, an organization that aimed to educate women about their political rights and encourage them to engage in the political process. This was part of her broader commitment to ensuring that women's voices were heard in the public sphere. Jane believed that women's participation in politics was essential to creating a more just and compassionate society, and she continued to work tirelessly to expand opportunities for women to influence social and political change. Hull House remained at the heart of Jane's work during this time. Though she'd gained national and international recognition, Jane never lost sight of the importance of the settlement house and the community it served. The house continued to provide essential services for immigrants, workers, and families. It was a place where people could come together to learn, to share their stories, and to find support. Hull House was not just an institution. It was a living expression of Jane's belief in the power of community and social cooperation. Despite the challenges of the 1920s, Jane Addams remained steadfast in her dedication to the principles of social justice. She continued to write, lecture, and engage in activism, using her platform to advocate for reforms in education, labour, and women's rights. Her voice became even more important as the political landscape began to shift in the direction of greater conservatism and authoritarianism. Jane knew that the hard-won progress of the past decades could easily be undone if the forces of oppression and inequality were allowed to regain power. The 1920s were a time of significant transformation for both Jane Addams and the broader social reform movement. Jane's efforts in the post-war era reflected her deep belief in the need for continuous work toward peace, social justice, and equality. Though the war had ended, Jane knew that the struggle for a better, more just world was far from over, and in many ways the challenges of the 1920s only fueled her determination to continue fighting for the values she held dear. Hull House was a place of learning, empowerment, and action, and Jane's leadership there remained a cornerstone of her broader work. The settlement house, along with Jane's other endeavours, continued to inspire generations of activists, social workers, and reformers. Her commitment to social change, human dignity, and equality was unwavering, and her work in the post-war years laid the foundation for future efforts to build a more just and compassionate society. As Jane Addams entered her later years, she continued to be a prominent figure in the realm of social reform, despite the challenges presented by her advancing age and declining health. By the 1930s, Hull House had grown into one of the most influential institutions in the United States, attracting social reformers, policymakers, and activists from across the country. Jane's leadership and vision had helped shape the course of American social work. But as the Great Depression deepened and the world faced the rise of fascism, Jane's work became even more urgent. During this period, Jane Addams's influence as a social leader reached its peak. She had earned a place among the most revered figures in the country, not only for her work at Hull House, but for her broader efforts in peace advocacy, labour rights, and women's suffrage. She was widely respected for her ability to combine practical social work with a larger vision of justice and human dignity. Yet even as she garnered admiration from all corners of society, she remained grounded in her commitment to the individuals and families who turned to Hull House for support. Jane's commitment to improving the lives of others was never more evident than in her advocacy during the Great Depression. As the economic collapse swept across the country, Jane became a vocal advocate for those who'd been hit hardest by the economic downturn. She continued to push for policies that would provide relief to the unemployed, improve housing conditions, and ensure that social services were available to those in need. Hull House remained a central resource for the community during this time, providing essential services to families struggling to survive. Despite the financial hardships faced by Hull House, Jane and her colleagues worked tirelessly to support the needs of the poor and displaced. In addition to her work in social welfare, Jane continued to focus on the international stage, particularly in regard to the rising political tensions in Europe. The 1930s saw the rise of fascist regimes in Italy, Germany, and Spain, and Jane was deeply concerned about the growing threat to democracy and peace. Though she had suffered a stroke in 1927, which affected her health, Jane was undeterred in her advocacy for peace and diplomacy. She spoke out against the dangers of fascism, authoritarianism, and militarism, warning that the world was on the brink of another war. She was a fierce critic of the growing tide of nationalism, which she believed threatened the principles of justice and equality that had guided her work throughout her life. As she continued to battle declining health, Jane's energy was increasingly devoted to her writing and speeches. She wrote extensively on the dangers of war and the importance of international cooperation. Her book, The Spirit of Youth and the City Streets, 1909, had already reflected her deep concern about the impact of war on children and young people, and her later writings expanded on these themes. Jane argued that the future of society depended on how nations treated their children and how governments fostered peace instead of war. Her belief in the power of education, diplomacy, and global cooperation remained unwavering. During these years, Jane also remained active in various peace organizations. She continued to participate in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, a group dedicated to advocating for the peaceful resolution of global conflicts. Her reputation as a pacifist and peace advocate made her one of the leading voices in the fight against war, and she used her platform to speak out against military aggression and the arms race. Jane was deeply disappointed by the failure of international diplomacy in the face of rising fascism, but she remained steadfast in her belief that peace could be achieved through understanding and cooperation. Despite the challenges she faced, Jane remained a figure of moral authority. Her work at Hull House continued to inspire a new generation of social reformers and activists, and her advocacy for peace and social justice resonated deeply in a world that was increasingly divided by political and economic upheaval. As the world moved toward another global conflict, Jane's belief in the importance of human dignity and social justice served as a guiding light for those who sought to build a better, more just world. In 1931, Jane Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her tireless efforts in promoting peace and social reform. She became the first American woman to receive the prestigious honor, cementing her place as one of the most important figures in the history of social work and peace advocacy. The award was a recognition of the profound impact Jane had made in the fight for human rights and justice, both in the United States and internationally. It was a testament to her unwavering commitment to peace, democracy, and social change. Even as Jane's health declined, she remained an active participant in the peace movement and continued to speak out against the injustices of the world. She believed that the struggles of her time, whether related to poverty, war, or political oppression, were interconnected, and she remained committed to addressing the root causes of inequality and violence. Her life's work had brought about lasting change, and her legacy would continue to shape social reform movements for generations to come. As she approached her final years, Jane Addams found herself in the midst of a world that was beginning to show the signs of yet another devastating war. But despite the growing uncertainty and the challenges of aging, she remained resolute in her belief that peace was possible. Her work at Hull House, her advocacy for labor rights, women's suffrage, and international diplomacy, and her lifelong commitment to social justice remained her guiding principles until the end. As Jane Addams entered the final years of her life, she had already established herself as one of the most respected and influential social reformers in the United States and across the globe. She had dedicated more than 4 decades to improving the lives of the poor, advocating for women's rights, championing peace, and promoting social justice. Hull House, which she had founded in 1889, had become a symbol of the settlement house movement and an institution that influenced generations of social workers, activists, and reformers. But in the early 1930s, Jane's health began to decline, and she was forced to slow down her work. Though age and illness took a toll on her, Jane remained deeply committed to her mission. Her sense of purpose never wavered, even in the face of her declining physical condition. In the years leading up to her death, Jane was still involved in key issues of the time, particularly in the struggle for peace and social justice. Her advocacy for the rights of workers, women, and marginalized communities remained central to her work. However, her health challenges were becoming more pronounced, and she had to increasingly rely on her colleagues and supporters to carry forward the vision she had dedicated her life to. Jane's health began to deteriorate more rapidly after suffering a stroke in 1927, which left her partially paralyzed. Despite this, she continued to speak out against the rise of fascism in Europe and the growing militarization of the world. She was increasingly worried about the spread of authoritarianism and the failure of diplomatic efforts to prevent global conflict. Still, Jane never stopped advocating for a peaceful and just society, using her platform to speak out against war and oppression. Throughout this period, Jane was also reflecting on her own legacy. She had lived a life full of accomplishment and had played a significant role in shaping the fields of social work, labor rights, women's suffrage, and international peace. She had received numerous honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. But Jane was never one for self-celebration. She saw herself as part of a broader movement for social change, and was always more focused on the work itself than on the recognition she received for it. In the final months of her life, Jane continued to write and engage with a world of social reform. She wrote about the dangers of war, the importance of international cooperation, and the need for continued efforts to create a just and equitable society. Her writings were a reflection of her deep moral convictions and her belief that lasting social change was possible through collective action and compassion. Despite her declining health, Jane's legacy continued to grow. The program she had started at Hull House remained in place, and Hull House itself became a model for social work across the United States. The ideas she had championed, community-based social reform, the integration of education and social services, and the importance of peace and diplomacy, had become core tenets of social work and activism. Her influence continued to be felt far beyond Hull House and the city of Chicago. Jane had laid the groundwork for future generations of reformers who would continue the work she had started. On May 21, 1935, Jane Addams passed away at the age of 74. Her death marked the end of an era for social reform in America, but her impact would endure. The world had lost a remarkable leader, but the values she had championed would continue to shape the course of history. Jane's life was a testament to the power of compassion, perseverance, and the belief that individuals and communities could create a better world. Her death was met with an outpouring of grief and admiration from around the world. Leaders in social work, politics, and peace all praised Jane's unwavering dedication to justice and her tireless efforts to improve the lives of the poor and marginalized. Hull House remained a vibrant institution, continuing to serve the community long after her passing. Jane's legacy lived on in the generations of social workers, activists, and reformers who carried forward her vision. In her final years, Jane Addams had worked to ensure that the causes she held dear would continue to thrive after her death. She had spent her life building a better world, and her contributions would have a lasting impact. Today, Jane is remembered not only for her work at Hull House, but also for her broader influence on social reform, peace, and human rights. She remains an inspiration to those who continue to fight for justice, equality, and a world free from war and oppression. Following Jane Addams' death in 1935, the impact of her work continued to reverberate throughout the world, especially in the realms of social work, peace advocacy, and women's rights. While Jane may have passed, her legacy lived on through the enduring influence of Hull House and the many reform movements she championed throughout her life. The ripple effect of her ideas was felt not only in Chicago, but across the United States and abroad, where her name became synonymous with compassion, community-driven change, and tireless advocacy for justice. At the heart of her lasting legacy was Hull House, the settlement house that had been the focus of much of Jane's life's work. After her death, Hull House remained a vital institution in the Chicago community, continuing to serve immigrant families, workers, and the impoverished. The principles of mutual respect, education, and self-empowerment that Jane had instilled in Hull House lived on through the work of social workers and community organisers who carried forward her vision. The settlement house model she had helped to pioneer became an enduring influence in the field of social work, and many other settlements across the country were established in its wake. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Hull House remained a centre for social change, continuing its programs in education, healthcare and civic engagement. Despite the challenges brought on by the Great Depression, the settlement house served as a lifeline for many Chicago residents, just as Jane had envisioned. Though Jane herself was no longer there, her spirit continued to guide the institution, which had grown into a cornerstone of the social reform movement. In the decades following her death, Jane's legacy continued to inspire social workers and activists who viewed her as a trailblazer in the fight for social justice. The importance of community-based social work, the integration of educational and social services, and the fundamental belief that every individual deserves dignity and respect, all principles she championed, became core components of modern social work practice. Jane's model of a settlement house, where people could live and work alongside those they sought to serve, became a guiding principle in the development of future social programs aimed at improving communities. In addition to her influence on social work, Jane Addams' impact on the women's rights movement endured. In the years following her death, her advocacy for women's suffrage, her work with the Women's Peace Party, and her fight for women's inclusion in political life were all recognized as foundational to the progress made by women in the 20th century. Her lifelong commitment to the idea that women should have a voice in shaping society helped lay the groundwork for the feminist movements of the 1960s and beyond. Jane's legacy also lived on in the field of international peace advocacy. Her work as a pacifist, especially her involvement with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, set a precedent for women's involvement in diplomacy and peace efforts. In an era when women were still largely excluded from positions of power, Jane proved that women could be at the forefront of efforts to end war and promote global cooperation. In the post-war years, her call for peace without victory, her resistance to the rise of militarism, and her belief in diplomacy and human rights resonated with activists and leaders who sought peaceful solutions to global conflicts. As the 20th century progressed, Jane Addams' work was increasingly recognized as an essential part of the American social reform movement. In 1931, she became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, a fitting tribute to her life's work. The recognition was not just for her role in the peace movement, but also for her broader contributions to social justice, education, and the betterment of society. In the years following her death, various memorials and honours were established in Jane's name, including scholarships, programs, and public spaces dedicated to her legacy. One of the most notable honours was the creation of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, which continues to preserve and share her story. The museum serves as both a tribute to her work and an educational resource for those who wish to learn more about the settlement house movement and Jane's impact on social reform. By the mid-20th century, Jane Addams had become a symbol of the power of social reform and the importance of addressing inequality through community-based action. Her influence extended far beyond Hull House, and her work inspired generations of social workers, peace advocates, and activists to continue pushing for a more just and compassionate world. The principles she espoused, education, compassion, mutual respect, and the belief that individuals can make a difference, continue to serve as guiding values for those who continue to fight for social justice. In the decades following her death, as civil rights movements, labor movements, and feminist movements gained momentum, Jane's life and work remained a source of inspiration. She was not only remembered for the practical work she had done, but also for the way in which she embodied the values of empathy, humility, and the belief in the capacity for change through collective action. Though the world had changed significantly in the years since her death, Jane Addams' commitment to social justice, peace, and human dignity remained a lasting touchstone for those working toward a better world. Her vision of a society where all people, regardless of their background or circumstances, could live with dignity and respect continues to inspire generations of reformers, social workers, and activists. Throughout her life, Jane Addams remained deeply committed to the cause of women's rights and the broader movement for gender equality. At a time when women were largely confined to the domestic sphere and often denied access to the political, educational, and economic opportunities that men enjoyed, Jane's work was revolutionary. She not only advocated for women's right to vote, but she also worked tirelessly to expand the opportunities available to women in society. In the early 20th century, women in the United States were just beginning to gain the right to vote, a major milestone in the women's suffrage movement. Jane Addams was one of the foremost leaders of this movement, using her platform at Hull House to call for women's political participation and to raise awareness about the importance of women's voices in shaping social policies. She believed that women's involvement in public life was not only essential for achieving gender equality, but also crucial for advancing social justice. At Hull House, Jane encouraged women to take on leadership roles, both within the settlement house and in their communities. She provided women with the tools they needed to make a difference, including education, advocacy, and direct social services. Hull House was a place where women could come together to discuss important issues, share ideas, and take collective action to address social problems. This was a radical idea at the time, as it placed women at the forefront of social change and gave them a space to engage in public life. Jane Addams' advocacy for women's rights was not limited to the right to vote. She also championed women's access to education and the workforce, recognizing that women's economic independence was key to achieving equality. In her work with immigrant women, she understood that economic empowerment was vital for lifting families out of poverty and providing women with the ability to make choices about their own lives. Hull House offered vocational training and job placement assistance, empowering women to enter the workforce and secure better economic opportunities. Jane also focused on the issue of child labour, which disproportionately affected young girls working in factories and mills. She believed that every child, regardless of gender, deserved the opportunity to receive an education and a chance to grow up in a safe and supportive environment. Through her advocacy, she helped pass laws that limited child labour and improved working conditions for young workers. This work, which benefited both girls and boys, was central to her broader vision of a more just society where all individuals, regardless of their background or gender, had access to equal opportunities. Jane's work also laid the groundwork for the rise of professional social work, a field that would eventually be dominated by women. She recognized that women had a unique role to play in social reform, given their experiences with domestic life and their roles as caregivers. By offering women the chance to engage in social work and community organizing, Jane helped to create a space for women to enter the workforce and contribute to the betterment of society in meaningful ways. Hull House became a training ground for social workers, many of whom were women, and these women went on to become leaders in the field of social reform. As Jane grew older and more involved in national and international peace efforts, her advocacy for women's rights continued to be a central focus of her work. She recognized that women had a unique perspective on issues of war and peace, having been directly affected by the wars of their time, whether as mothers, wives, or daughters. Women, Jane believed, had a moral responsibility to advocate for peace, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that women's voices were heard in global discussions about war and diplomacy. She was a vocal critic of militarism and the rise of fascism in Europe, arguing that the world could avoid conflict through cooperation and understanding rather than force. In the years following her death, Jane Addams' contributions to the women's rights movement were celebrated, and her work was recognized as foundational to the broader feminist movements that would emerge in the mid-20th century. She had paved the way for women to take on more significant roles in public life, from voting and education to the workforce and international diplomacy. Jane's belief in the power of women to shape society remained an essential part of her legacy. Her efforts were instrumental in changing the way society viewed women's roles. By establishing Hull House, advocating for women's suffrage, and promoting women's rights to education and employment, Jane helped create a framework for the liberation of women that would continue to evolve for generations. She showed that women were not just passive recipients of social change, but active agents capable of bringing about profound transformation in their communities and the world. One of Jane Addams' most enduring legacies is her pivotal role in shaping the field of social work. In the early 20th century, the field was still in its infancy, and much of the work was done informally or as volunteer-based efforts. However, Jane's vision for a structured, professional approach to social welfare transformed the landscape of social services in the United States and laid the groundwork for the profession we recognize today. In founding Hull House, Jane Addams not only provided essential services to impoverished immigrant families, but she also established a living example of the kind of social reform that combined direct action with social theory. She believed deeply in the importance of understanding the lived experiences of those in need and empowering them to improve their own lives. Hull House became a laboratory for social experimentation, where reformers could test ideas on how to alleviate poverty, address public health issues, and provide educational opportunities. It was at Hull House that many early social workers honed their skills and developed the theories that would form the foundation of professional social work. Jane's approach to social work was rooted in empathy, and she believed that social workers needed to be trained not just in theory, but in the practical, real-world challenges facing vulnerable populations. She argued that social work should be a profession that valued the human element of care, where social workers could engage with individuals and communities to understand their unique struggles and strengths. To support this vision, Jane worked alongside colleagues to develop the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy in 1904, one of the first institutions in the United States to offer formal training for social workers. The school was revolutionary in that it not only taught social workers about the intricacies of public policy and social theory, but it also emphasized the importance of fieldwork and hands-on experience. The Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy marked a significant shift in the social reform movement. It provided the education and tools that allowed social work to evolve from an informal, volunteer-based effort to a recognized, structured profession. Many of the social workers who trained at Hull House and the Chicago School went on to become leaders in the field, shaping social policy and influencing the direction of social work for decades to come. Jane Addams' commitment to social work also helped to elevate the profession's standing in the public eye. In a time when women were often excluded from professional careers, Jane's work demonstrated that social work was not only a noble, but a necessary profession that could directly impact the lives of the marginalized. Through her tireless advocacy, Jane helped establish social work as a respected field, capable of producing concrete change in communities. She showed that social work was a blend of practical service and intellectual pursuit, requiring both compassion and expertise. Jane's influence extended far beyond Hull House. She played a significant role in the creation of the National Conference of Social Work, formerly known as the National Conference of Charities and Correction, which became a critical forum for social workers to share knowledge and collaborate on best practices. She served as president of the organization for many years and used the platform to push for improvements in social policies, advocating for better living conditions for the poor, expanded access to education, and stronger labor protections. In addition to her work in formal social work education, Jane also made significant contributions to the development of child welfare and juvenile justice systems in the United States. She was a strong advocate for the protection of children, believing that the state had a responsibility to ensure that children were given opportunities for education and a healthy, safe upbringing. She worked to change policies surrounding child labor, advocating for laws that would prevent children from working in hazardous environments and ensure that they could receive an education. Jane's commitment to reform extended to the broader issues of social justice. She was involved in campaigns for improved housing, labor rights, and women's suffrage. Her focus on addressing the root causes of poverty, such as lack of education, employment opportunities, and healthcare, led her to participate in multiple national and international campaigns, where she used her influence to advocate for marginalized communities. Through Hull House and her national activism, Jane helped to shape the broader landscape of social welfare policy in the United States. Her work with the settlement house movement and her emphasis on community-based solutions influenced generations of social workers who came after her. Hull House provided a model for future social workers to follow, emphasizing that working directly with individuals in need, rather than merely administering charity, was the key to lasting social change. Jane's impact on the field was so profound that the profession of social work continues to be grounded in many of the principles she helped establish: empathy, education, and community empowerment. By the 1930s, Jane's legacy in the field of social work had become widely recognized. She had transformed the way Americans thought about social services and social justice. Her commitment to community-based action, her advocacy for women and children, and her belief in the transformative power of education and professional development all shaped the profession into what it is today. Her vision of social work as a tool for societal transformation continues to guide the profession, and her work has had a lasting impact on social policies that continue to benefit marginalized communities. Hull House, the settlement house Jane Addams founded in 1889, became one of the most influential institutions of its kind in the United States. Over the years, it not only provided essential services to immigrants and working-class families in Chicago, but it also became a symbol of the settlement house movement that sought to address the root causes of poverty and inequality. Jane Addams and Hull House played a central role in shaping social reform, and the impact of this movement was felt far beyond Chicago. From the very beginning, Hull House was more than just a place that provided food or shelter. It was a community-based institution that brought together the privileged and the impoverished to work side by side in the pursuit of social justice. Jane's vision for Hull House was not to simply offer charity, but to create a space for mutual learning and empowerment. She believed that the wealthy and the poor could learn from each other and, through collaboration, create solutions to the social problems that plagued society. Hull House became a hub of social, political, and educational activity. Early on, the house offered a range of services to immigrants, including English language classes, job training, childcare, and healthcare. Jane Addams recognized that in order to help individuals achieve self-sufficiency, it was essential to provide more than just short-term assistance. Long-term support was needed to empower people to take control of their lives and improve their circumstances. Hull House became a place where people could come together, share resources, and learn how to navigate the complexities of life in a new country. As the settlement house grew, so did the range of services it offered. Hull House became a center for political activism, where reformers and activists gathered to discuss issues such as labor rights, women's suffrage, and child welfare. Jane Addams worked tirelessly to connect her work at Hull House with broader political movements, advocating for legislative changes that would improve the lives of the poor, particularly women and children. Her leadership at Hull House allowed it to serve as a model for other settlement houses across the country. One of the most important aspects of the settlement house movement, as embodied by Hull House, was its emphasis on the dignity and worth of every individual. Jane Addams believed that true social reform could only occur if people were treated with respect and allowed to participate fully in their communities. This philosophy extended to the programs at Hull House, which were designed to provide people not only with the practical tools they needed to improve their lives, but also with a sense of pride and self-respect. At Hull House, Jane introduced educational programs that gave people the opportunity to learn not only basic skills, such as reading and writing, but also subjects like art, music, and literature. These programs were aimed at improving the intellectual and cultural lives of those who attended, helping them to feel more connected to the broader society. Hull House also served as a meeting place for people to discuss political and social issues, which allowed those who lived in the settlement to become more engaged in the world around them. Jane saw this as essential to creating a more just society. Empowered individuals could contribute to societal change in meaningful ways. Hull House's success inspired the creation of other settlement houses in cities across the United States, including New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. These new institutions followed the model set by Jane Addams, offering a variety of services to underserved communities and encouraging the integration of the poor into the social and political fabric of the nation. Through Hull House, Jane helped to establish the idea of social work as a profession, training a new generation of social workers who would go on to advocate for the rights of the poor and marginalized. Her approach to social reform, which combined direct action with political engagement, became a cornerstone of social work practice in the 20th century. Hull House's influence extended far beyond the United States. Jane Addams became an internationally recognized leader in the settlement house movement, and Hull House was visited by social reformers from around the world. Jane's ideas about the importance of community-based social services and her advocacy for peace, social justice, and women's rights resonated with activists in Europe, Asia, and beyond. Hull House was a model for similar institutions in other countries, and Jane's work helped to shape global discussions on social reform. In the 1920s and 1930s, Hull House continued to be a vital part of the Chicago community. Even as Jane's health began to decline, her commitment to Hull House never wavered. She continued to advocate for the needs of the poor, particularly during the Great Depression, when the economic crisis left many families struggling to survive. Hull House played an important role in providing relief during this time, offering food, medical care, and job placement services to those who'd been affected by the economic collapse. Despite the challenges posed by the Great Depression, Hull House remained a beacon of hope for many in Chicago. It served as a reminder that communities could come together to create change, and that individuals, no matter their background or social standing, could make a difference. Hull House stood as a testament to Jane Addams' belief in the power of community-based action and the importance of working together to create a better, more just society. By the time Jane Addams passed away in 1935, Hull House had already left an indelible mark on American social reform. The settlement house movement, which had begun as a small experiment in social change, had grown into a major force for good. The work that Jane Addams had started continued to be carried out by others, ensuring that Hull House's legacy would live on long after her death. In addition to her groundbreaking work at Hull House and her domestic social reforms, Jane Addams was also deeply engaged in global peace efforts throughout her life. As a leading advocate for peace during the early 20th century, she firmly believed in the power of diplomacy and cooperation between nations to prevent war and build a more just world. Her commitment to peace was not simply an extension of her humanitarian work. It was a core principle that guided much of her public life. Jane Addams was particularly concerned with the escalating tensions in Europe and the rise of militarism and nationalism that eventually led to World War I. She recognized the devastating consequences of armed conflict, particularly on women and children, and she sought ways to mitigate the impact of war through international cooperation and dialogue. From her work with the Women's Peace Party to her involvement in global peace organizations, Addams used her influence to advocate for peaceful solutions to global disputes. One of Jane's most significant contributions to the global peace movement came in 1915 when she participated in the International Congress of Women, held in The Hague, Netherlands. The Congress brought together women from around the world who shared a common goal: to find ways to prevent the war and promote lasting peace. Jane's involvement in the Congress was a pivotal moment in her career as a peace activist. She worked alongside other women's rights leaders to devise strategies for diplomacy and peace building, including the creation of an international organization dedicated to promoting peace and disarmament. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF, founded during the Congress, became a major vehicle for Jane's peace advocacy. She was named president of the organization and worked tirelessly to ensure that women's voices were heard in global discussions about war and peace. Jane's leadership within WILPF was instrumental in positioning women as key players in the political and diplomatic arenas, challenging traditional notions that diplomacy and international relations were the exclusive domain of men. Throughout her work with WILPF and other international peace organizations, Jane Addams consistently emphasized the importance of education and diplomacy in achieving peace. She believed that peace was not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, equity, and cooperation among nations. Her vision of peace was one in which countries would work together to resolve conflicts through dialogue, mutual understanding, and shared goals. For Jane, war was a failure of humanity to live up to its highest ideals. In the years following the end of World War I, Jane Addams continued to work for global peace. She was a strong advocate for the League of Nations, the international organization formed after the war to promote peace and cooperation among nations. Jane believed that the League represented an opportunity for nations to move away from the traditional reliance on military force and toward a more collaborative approach to international relations. However, she was deeply disappointed when the United States refused to join the League, a decision she saw as a missed opportunity for peace building. Even as the world moved into the turbulent years of the 1930s, Jane Addams remained a steadfast advocate for diplomacy and disarmament. She was particularly alarmed by the rise of fascism and the increasing militarization of Europe, and she continued to speak out against the dangers of war. Though Jane was not able to prevent the outbreak of World War II, her work in advocating for peace set the stage for future generations of diplomats and activists who would continue the fight for a more peaceful world. Her contributions to global peace did not go unnoticed. In 1931, Jane was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her lifelong commitment to peace, diplomacy, and social justice. She became the first American woman to receive the prestigious honor, a recognition of her tireless efforts to promote peace and her belief in the power of non-violent solutions to global conflicts. While Jane was deeply humbled by the award, she saw it as a continuation of the work she'd been doing for decades, advocating for a world where war was not the answer, and where international cooperation could create a more just and peaceful society. In her later years, Jane remained active in the peace movement, although her health was in decline. She continued to speak out against the rise of militarism, particularly in Europe, and to urge international leaders to prioritize diplomacy over military action. She remained a vocal critic of the growing authoritarian regimes in Europe and the dangers posed by their expansion. Jane's work as a pacifist leader, particularly her efforts to position women as agents of change in global diplomacy, would have a lasting influence on future generations of peace activists. Through her work in international peace, Jane Addams demonstrated that social justice and peace were not separate endeavors but were interconnected. Her advocacy for women's rights, labor reform, and social justice was inextricably linked to her belief in global peace and diplomacy. For Jane, true justice could only be achieved when nations, governments, and individuals work together to resolve conflicts, promote equality, and uphold human dignity. Her vision of a peaceful world based on cooperation and mutual respect continues to inspire peace builders and advocates for global justice today. As Jane Addams continued her work at Hull House, she laid the groundwork for the professionalization of social work in the United States. Hull House, founded in 1889, had already been a pioneer in providing social services to immigrant communities and the working poor in Chicago. But beyond the direct services offered, Hull House also became a hub for training social workers and developing a deeper understanding of social issues. Jane's role in the evolution of social work cannot be overstated. She helped shape the modern conception of social work as a profession, emphasizing that social work should be rooted in empathy, education, and systemic reform. By the 1930s, Hull House had evolved into a vital institution for social reform, providing educational programs, childcare, healthcare, and legal assistance to the people of Chicago. It also became a model for other settlement houses in the United States and abroad. Hull House's success stemmed from Jane Addams' deep commitment to integrating social services with education, creating an environment where those in need could receive not just temporary relief, but opportunities for empowerment and self-sufficiency. Jane believed that in order to address the complex issues facing poor and immigrant communities, social work had to be more than just charity or assistance. It had to focus on long-term, systemic change. At Hull House, social work was about educating individuals and communities, advocating for labor rights, improving living conditions, and helping people access the resources they needed to improve their lives. She believed that social work should be holistic, and that true change could only happen when people were empowered to become active agents in their own lives. Hull House's importance grew as it became one of the first institutions in the United States to train social workers. Jane's commitment to professionalizing social work was realized in 1904 when she helped establish the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, which became one of the first schools to offer formal training for social workers. The school provided students with both theoretical knowledge and practical fieldwork experience, which became the foundation for social work education. Graduates of the school went on to become leaders in the growing field of social work, shaping social policy and advocating for marginalized communities. Hull House also became a center for research and scholarship on social issues. Jane encouraged scholars, activists, and social workers to engage with the pressing social problems of the day, conducting research and using the findings to influence policy and create meaningful change. The settlement house was a place where practical solutions to social problems could be tested and refined, making it an incubator for social reform. Jane's vision for Hull House was that it would be both a place of direct service and a place for intellectual engagement, where ideas and actions came together to create lasting impact. By the time Jane Addams passed away in 1935, Hull House had already been a central force in social reform for over 4 decades. However, the legacy of Hull House did not end with Jane's death. The institution continued to play a critical role in social work and advocacy throughout the 20th century. Social work became increasingly professionalized, with more schools and institutions offering formal training for social workers. The idea that social workers should be educated not just in practical skills, but also in social justice and advocacy, became a core principle of the profession. Jane's work helped to shape these ideas and set the standard for future social work education and practice. Even as Hull House continued to serve its community and educate social workers, Jane's influence on the broader social reform movement persisted. Her work inspired generations of social reformers, social workers, and advocates for social justice who carried forward her vision of a more equitable and just society. She believed that social change could only occur when individuals and communities were given the tools to improve their own lives, and Hull House was a living testament to that philosophy. In the years following Jane's death, Hull House continued to expand its programs, serving new generations of immigrants and working-class families in Chicago. While the institution went through periods of financial difficulty and challenges related to changing political and social climates, the spirit of Jane Addams' work remained a guiding force. Social work as a profession continued to evolve, and Hull House became synonymous with the values of empowerment, dignity, and social justice that Jane had championed throughout her life. The profession of social work, which had been born out of Jane Addams' vision at Hull House, became increasingly institutionalized, with social workers taking on important roles in government, schools, healthcare, and community organizations. The work that began with Hull House influenced the development of social welfare programs in the United States, including the New Deal, and later programs such as Medicare and Social Security. These programs, which aimed to address poverty and inequality, were influenced by the social work principles that Jane had helped to establish. Jane Addams' commitment to professionalizing social work, combined with her belief in social justice and community empowerment, created a foundation for a profession that would go on to help millions of people around the world. Hull House's legacy continued well into the 20th century, and its influence can still be felt in the field of social work today. The vision that Jane Addams set in motion in the late 19th century has shaped not only the profession, but also the way that society addresses issues of poverty, inequality, and human dignity. Throughout her life, Jane Addams was not only a champion of social reform at the grassroots level, but she also recognized the critical importance of influencing public policy in order to bring about lasting change. Her belief in the interconnectedness of social work and public policy shaped much of her work, and she dedicated a significant portion of her career to advocating for policies that would address the root causes of poverty and inequality. Jane's work with Hull House was inherently political because it sought not only to alleviate suffering, but to change the conditions that caused that suffering in the first place. One of Jane Addams' key contributions to public policy was her advocacy for labor rights. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrial workers, particularly women and children, were often exploited by factory owners and business interests. The working conditions were dangerous, the hours were long, and wages were low. Jane understood that while social work could provide immediate relief, systemic changes were necessary to improve the lives of the working class. She fought tirelessly for legislation that would protect workers and ensure their rights to fair wages, safe working conditions, and reasonable hours. As Hull House became more entrenched in the social reform movement, Jane's advocacy began to influence local and state governments. She lobbied for child labor laws, regulations on factory conditions, and support for working women. One of the landmark achievements of Jane's work was her involvement in the passing of Illinois' 1893 factory inspection law, which required the establishment of factory inspectors to monitor working conditions in factories. This law was one of the first of its kind in the United States, and was a direct result of Jane's relentless advocacy on behalf of working-class people. Beyond labor rights, Jane was also deeply committed to improving public health and education. In the years following the founding of Hull House, she expanded the settlement house's focus to include healthcare services for the community. Hull House offered a variety of health programs, including a kindergarten for young children, a health clinic, and classes that taught people how to prevent and manage common illnesses. Jane believed that access to basic health care was a fundamental human right, and she used her influence to promote policies that would improve health conditions for the poor. In addition to healthcare, Jane advocated for greater access to education, particularly for children from immigrant families. At Hull House, she provided educational opportunities that went beyond basic literacy and included classes in English, art, and music. She also believed that children should be taught not just skills that would make them productive workers, but also the broader values of citizenship and civic responsibility. Her educational programs reflected her belief in the power of education to improve lives and elevate communities, and she used Hull House as a model for public school reform in Chicago. Jane's advocacy for education was not limited to children. She worked to promote adult education and continued to push for programs that would allow people of all ages to improve their skills and better their lives. She believed that education was the key to social mobility, and that providing educational opportunities was one of the most effective ways to combat poverty. Jane's work in education was also an important part of her larger philosophy of empowerment. She believed that if people were given the knowledge and resources they needed, they could take control of their own lives and build a better future for themselves and their families. By the early 20th century, Jane had become an influential voice in the movement for progressive social reform. Her ideas about social justice, labor rights, and education had gained traction in political circles, and she had become an important advisor to policymakers. Jane worked closely with politicians, philanthropists, and fellow activists to shape the direction of social welfare programs at the local, state, and national levels. One of the areas where Jane's influence was particularly felt was in the development of the modern welfare state. As part of the progressive movement, she worked alongside other reformers to push for policies that would provide social services to the poor, including public housing, unemployment insurance, and social security. Jane was a vocal advocate for the establishment of these policies, and she saw them as essential to building a just society. While some of the specific programs she supported would not come to fruition until later, her work laid the foundation for the social safety net that would become a hallmark of the New Deal and subsequent welfare programs. Jane Addams' contributions to public policy were integral to the social reform movement in the United States. Through her work with Hull House, her involvement in labor rights advocacy, and her tireless efforts to improve healthcare and education, Jane was able to push for systemic changes that would benefit the most vulnerable members of society. She understood that social work and public policy were not separate endeavors, but interconnected efforts that needed to be addressed simultaneously in order to achieve lasting change. Her advocacy for policies that supported women, children, and working-class families helped shape the direction of social welfare programs in the US, and influence future generations of policymakers and activists. Jane Addams' legacy is not just one of social service, it is also one of social change through public policy, where her work in social reform, education, labor rights, and peace influenced the development of policies that continue to affect lives. Today, as Jane Addams entered the 1930s, her health began to decline, but her dedication to social reform never wavered. Despite physical limitations, she remained actively involved in social justice causes, advocating for peace, labor rights, and women's issues. Her legacy as a founder of the settlement house movement and a key figure in American social work was already well established. Yet she continued to serve as an influential voice for progressive social change until her final days. In 1927, Jane suffered a stroke, which left her partially paralyzed and significantly impacted her mobility and speech. The stroke marked the beginning of a gradual decline in her health. Yet, even with these challenges, Jane remained committed to the causes she had championed her entire life. She continued to write, give speeches, and engage in public activism as much as her health allowed. But these activities became increasingly difficult for her to manage on her own. By the early 1930s, Jane's physical condition had deteriorated further, and she relied more heavily on the support of her friends, colleagues, and doctors. Despite her declining health, Jane remained intellectually sharp and emotionally dedicated to her work. Her influence in the world of social reform remained strong, and she continued to be a vital figure in the fight for peace, social justice, and women's rights. Her time spent at Hull House, her international peace efforts, and her advocacy for labor rights had already left an indelible mark on the world. But in her later years, Jane's focus shifted toward maintaining the institution she'd helped build and supporting the social workers who would continue her work. In the 1930s, the world was undergoing significant political and economic changes. The Great Depression had caused widespread suffering, and the rise of fascism in Europe posed new and troubling threats to global peace. Jane, who had spent much of her life advocating for a world free of violence and war, was deeply concerned by these developments. The economic instability of the Depression era also prompted her to work for the expansion of social safety nets and welfare programs for the poor and unemployed. She continued to use her influence to call for greater economic reforms, especially in the areas of labor rights and unemployment insurance. Although she was physically weakened by her health problems, Jane remained actively involved in her social work network. She was still an inspiration to the next generation of social workers, many of whom had been trained at Hull House and were now working to carry forward her vision of social justice. Jane was particularly proud of the growing professionalism in social work, which she had helped nurture through the establishment of social work schools and the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy. These institutions were now producing skilled social workers who were tackling issues like poverty, child labour and housing inequality. One of the key challenges Jane faced in her later years was balancing her intense commitment to her causes with the reality of her declining health. Despite the challenges she encountered, she never stopped working. Her commitment to advocacy remained unwavering, and she continued to write and engage in public discussions about social reform. Her position as a respected leader in the social work and peace movements gave her a platform to influence policymakers and inspire others to take action. Even in her weakened state, Jane was deeply engaged in international peace efforts. The threat of war loomed larger than ever, and she felt a renewed urgency to continue her work for global peace. She remained an outspoken critic of fascism and militarism, urging the world to learn from the devastating consequences of World War I. Jane's voice was an important part of the peace movement in the 1930s, advocating for diplomacy, disarmament, and international cooperation. Although Jane's health had begun to limit her capacity for physical action, she never relinquished her commitment to creating a more just and peaceful world. Her life's work had already made a profound impact, and the values she'd promoted, social justice, equality, and the importance of community, continued to shape the course of social reform in the United States and around the world. Her belief that social work should be grounded in empathy, respect, and collaboration influenced countless activists and social workers who followed in her footsteps. By the time Jane Addams passed away in 1935, her health had taken a significant toll on her body, but her intellectual and moral contributions to social reform remained intact. She had lived a life of purpose, guided by a deep sense of duty to the marginalized and oppressed. Her later years were marked by physical challenges, but her dedication to peace, social justice, and the empowerment of women and communities remained as strong as ever. Jane's ability to continue advocating for her causes in the face of illness is a testament to the strength of her character and her commitment to the betterment of society. Her death was met with widespread mourning, but it also prompted a celebration of her life's work. Jane Addams had left an indelible mark on American society, and her legacy would continue to inspire social reformers, peace advocates, and women's rights activists for generations to come. Her work at Hull House, her role in the settlement house movement, and her contributions to the professionalization of social work were all key aspects of her lasting impact on social justice. Though Jane Addams passed away in 1935, her legacy has continued to inspire and shape the fields of social work, social justice, and peace advocacy for decades. She remains one of the most important figures in American social reform, known for her groundbreaking work in the settlement house movement. her tireless advocacy for peace, and her commitment to the empowerment of marginalized communities. Jane's influence has endured through the many institutions she helped establish, the principles she championed, and the countless individuals who have carried forward her vision of a more just and compassionate world. In the years following her death, Jane Addams' work became more widely recognized, and she was posthumously celebrated as a trailblazer for women in social work and public policy. Her role as a leader in the women's suffrage movement, her advocacy for labor rights, and her outspoken stance against war and militarism all earned her a prominent place in American history. In 1931, she became the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, a recognition that cemented her position as one of the foremost peace advocates of the 20th century. Hull House, which Jane had founded and nurtured, continued to operate as a settlement house long after her death. The institution remained a beacon of social reform and a model for other social service organizations across the country. Hull House provided vital services to immigrant families and low-income communities in Chicago, just as it had during Jane's lifetime. It also continued to serve as an educational institution, training social workers and activists who would go on to make significant contributions to social justice. In addition to Hull House, Jane's philosophy of social work and community engagement has had a lasting impact on the field of social services. Social work as a profession became increasingly formalized during the 20th century, and Jane's approach to social service as a combination of education, advocacy, and direct action became a guiding principle for future social workers. Her work was a precursor to the development of the modern welfare state, and many of the policies she championed, such as labor protections, child welfare laws, and women's rights, helped to shape the social safety net in the United States. Beyond social work, Jane Addams' influence extended to the broader movements for peace and human rights. Her advocacy for diplomacy and nonviolent solutions to international conflicts made her a key figure in the peace movement. Her leadership in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, as well as her work at the International Congress of Women, helped to place women at the forefront of global peace efforts. Jane's vision of a world where diplomacy and cooperation replace war and violence continues to inspire peace activists today. Her legacy also lives on in the feminist movements that emerged in the mid-20th century. Jane was a pioneering figure in the fight for women's rights, advocating for women's suffrage, better access to education, and equal economic opportunities. She demonstrated that women could play a significant role in shaping both domestic and international policy, and her example has inspired generations of women to take leadership roles in public life. Jane's work also laid the foundation for later feminist movements, which would continue to push for gender equality and social justice in the decades that followed. As the world entered the second half of the 20th century, Jane Addams' influence continued to be felt across a variety of fields, from social work and women's rights to peace and international relations. Her commitment to improving the lives of the poor, advocating for human dignity, and striving for peace has remained a guiding light for activists, reformers, and social workers who continue to fight for social justice. Her enduring legacy is also reflected in the many memorials and honors that have been established in her name. In Chicago, the Jane Addams Hull House Museum serves as a tribute to her life and work. The museum offers educational programs, exhibits, and events that highlight her contributions to social reform and the ongoing relevance of her ideals. Jane's name is also honored through scholarships, awards, and social work programs that continue to promote the values she espoused throughout her life. In 1992, Hull House was designated as a National Historic Landmark, recognizing the profound impact Jane Addams had on the history of social reform in the United States. The building, now home to the museum, stands as a symbol of her vision of social change through community engagement and mutual respect. it continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of addressing the needs of the marginalized and working toward a more just and equitable society. Beyond Hull House, Jane's ideas have been integrated into social work education and practice worldwide. Social workers are trained to follow the principles of advocacy, empathy, and community-based action that Jane championed, and her influence is still felt in the way that social work programs are structured today. Her belief in the power of education, social services, and direct action to change lives and uplift communities has shaped generations of social workers who've continued her work around the globe. As Jane Addams became a recognized leader in the global peace movement, her advocacy for diplomacy, international cooperation, and disarmament transcended national borders. Her unwavering commitment to peace was rooted in her belief that the suffering caused by war could be avoided through understanding, negotiation, and collective action. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, as tensions in Europe and Asia escalated, Jane remained steadfast in her opposition to war and her belief that women, in particular, had a crucial role to play in fostering global peace. Jane's most notable contribution to the international peace movement came in 1915, when she participated in the International Congress of Women, held in The Hague, Netherlands. This event marked a defining moment in her career as she stood alongside other women from around the world to call for an end to the conflict that was already tearing Europe apart. Jane and the other delegates at The Hague advocated for a peaceful resolution to World War I, and their efforts led to the formation of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF. The League became one of the most influential peace organizations of the 20th century, dedicated to promoting disarmament, international cooperation, and women's active participation in diplomacy. As president of WILPF, Jane worked tirelessly to bring attention to the atrocities of war and to advocate for policies that would prevent future conflicts. Her speeches and writings on the topic of peace were grounded in her belief that war was not inevitable, but rather the result of human failure to resolve conflicts peacefully. She rejected the idea that military force was an acceptable solution to global problems, and she argued that peace could only be achieved through dialogue and mutual respect between nations. Despite the growing militarism in Europe, Jane's pacifism remained resolute. She continued to promote international diplomacy and peace through various channels, including speaking engagements, correspondence with world leaders, and advocacy for peace treaties. Throughout the 1920s, Jane worked with international organizations like the League of Nations, pushing for reforms that would prevent the outbreak of future wars. Her efforts helped lay the groundwork for a global peace movement that would later gain significant traction after the devastation of World War II. In addition to her work with WILPF, Jane was also involved in numerous other peace initiatives. She was a vocal critic of the arms race and the growing tension between the United States, Europe, and Japan. Jane believed that arms proliferation not only endangered global security, but also drained valuable resources that could be better used for social and economic development. She argued that the pursuit of military power was detrimental to the welfare of nations and their citizens, and she advocated for the diversion of military spending towards social welfare programs that would benefit the poor, the sick, and the disenfranchised. Jane's peace activism was not limited to her work with formal peace organizations. She also sought to engage the public and raise awareness about the devastating consequences of war. She used her platform to speak to the American public about the moral, political, and economic costs of military conflict. She was an outspoken critic of American involvement in foreign wars and believed that the United States should focus on creating peace at home and abroad through diplomacy and cooperation, rather than through military force. Her efforts to promote peace through education and public discourse were grounded in her deep empathy for the human cost of war. Jane was particularly concerned with the impact of war on children, seeing them as the most vulnerable victims of conflict. In her writings, she frequently emphasized the need to protect future generations from the trauma of war, and she believed that a world built on peace and cooperation would allow children to grow up in environments free from violence and fear. She argued that investing in education, healthcare, and social welfare was the best way to prevent war and create a more peaceful world for future generations. Despite the growing political tensions in the 1930s and the increasing likelihood of another global conflict, Jane remained a vocal advocate for peace and diplomacy. She continued to speak out against the rise of fascism in Europe and the increasing militarization of Japan, warning that the world was on the brink of another war. Though she could not prevent the outbreak of World War II, Jane's work as a peace advocate set the stage for the international efforts that would follow, particularly in the creation of the United Nations. Throughout her life, Jane Addams remained unwavering in her belief that peace was achievable and that women had an essential role to play in the pursuit of global harmony. She understood that peace was not simply the absence of war, but the active promotion of justice, equality, and cooperation among nations. Jane's vision of peace continues to resonate with peace builders and diplomats today, and her legacy as one of the foremost peace advocates of the 20th century remains an enduring inspiration for those who seek to build a more peaceful world. Throughout Jane Addams' life, she dedicated herself to the improvement of the social welfare system in the United States, particularly focusing on the rights of workers, women, and immigrants. Her work in advocating for labor rights, child welfare, and social services formed the bedrock of many of the social policies that would become staples of the American welfare system. Jane was not just a social reformer. She was a visionary who understood the importance of integrating social work into public policy to create lasting change. At the turn of the 20th century, industrialization was rapidly transforming American society. The rise of factory-based labor, particularly in cities like Chicago, led to a growing population of immigrant workers who were often subjected to unsafe working conditions, low wages, and long hours. Jane saw these conditions firsthand through her work at Hull House and felt a deep moral obligation to address these issues. She quickly recognized that while providing direct assistance to those in need was crucial, lasting change could only be achieved through systemic reforms to protect the rights of workers and the marginalized. One of Jane's key contributions to labor rights was her role in advocating for child labor laws. At the time, children worked in factories, mills, and mines under dangerous conditions for very low wages. Jane worked closely with other reformers to push for legislation that would prohibit child labor and ensure that children could receive an education instead of being sent to work. Her advocacy was instrumental in the passage of child labor laws in Illinois and eventually led to national legislation that set standards for child labor and working conditions across the country. Jane also recognized that women, especially immigrant women, were particularly vulnerable in the workforce. She saw how women were often forced to take low-paying, physically demanding jobs in factories and sweatshops, with few protections or rights. Jane worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the exploitation of women workers and advocated for better labor conditions, including wage regulations and workplace safety measures. Through her efforts, she helped lay the groundwork for the women's labor movement and the eventual establishment of laws that would protect women's rights in the workplace. Her focus on women's labor rights was not just about addressing workplace conditions, but also about improving women's economic independence. Jane believed that women should have the same opportunities as men to access education, secure employment, and become financially independent. Her advocacy for women's rights extended beyond labor reform to include broader issues such as women's suffrage, the right to education, and access to health care. Hull House became a vital institution for women in the labor movement, offering educational programs, legal aid, and support for working women who were seeking to improve their conditions. While much of Jane's work in social reform was rooted in addressing the immediate needs of workers and their families, she also focused on building a long-term system of social welfare that would provide ongoing support for the most vulnerable members of society. Her work laid the foundation for the American welfare system, which would expand in the coming decades with the introduction of programs such as Social Security and unemployment insurance. Jane's belief in the importance of social services, such as healthcare, education, and housing, was ahead of its time, and many of the policies she championed are still in place today. In addition to her work in labor rights and social welfare, Jane Addams played a significant role in the development of professional social work. As one of the early pioneers in the field, she believed that social workers needed to be highly trained and equipped with both theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Hull House became a center for social work education, providing training to a new generation of social workers who would go on to impact social welfare programs across the country. Through her leadership, Jane helped to establish social work as a respected profession, one that combined intellectual rigor with a deep commitment to social justice. Jane's work in labor rights and social welfare was not just about improving individual lives, but about transforming society as a whole. She understood that systemic change required the involvement of both grassroots activists and policymakers. Through her work, she sought to create a social safety net that would protect workers, women, and marginalized communities from exploitation and injustice. She was an advocate for policies that would ensure that all people, regardless of their background or social standing, had access to the resources they needed to live with dignity and security. Her efforts were instrumental in changing public opinion about the role of the government in providing social welfare. In the early 20th century, many people viewed social services as the responsibility of private charity rather than public policy. However, Jane's advocacy for labor laws, child welfare, and women's rights helped shift the national conversation, making it clear that social services were a public responsibility that should be backed by government policy and funding. Through her work in social welfare, labor rights, and education, Jane Addams created a legacy that continues to impact American society today. Her ideas about social reform, social work, and public policy remain foundational to the welfare system, and her work continues to inspire those who seek to create a more just and compassionate society. Jane's unwavering belief in the importance of dignity, empowerment, and equal opportunity for all people has left an indelible mark on the history of social justice in the United States and around the world. As the 20th century dawned, Jane Addams found herself at the center of a broader movement for social, political, and economic reform in the United States. The Progressive Era, which spanned from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, was a period marked by widespread efforts to address the rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social inequality that defined the era. Jane, already a respected figure in the settlement house movement, became a leading voice in the progressive movement, advocating for systemic changes that would improve the lives of the poor, laborers, women, and children. The progressive movement sought to reform a variety of social issues, including the exploitation of workers, unsafe working conditions, poor public health, the lack of access to education, and the disenfranchisement of women. Jane's work at Hull House was inherently aligned with these goals, as she had spent years advocating for better living conditions, education, and opportunities for marginalized communities. Her focus on labor rights, women's suffrage, child welfare, and peace activism placed her squarely in the midst of the reform efforts that defined the progressive era. One of Jane's key contributions to progressive reform was her involvement in the movement for labor rights. As industrialization spread, more and more Americans found themselves working in factories with grueling hours and unsafe conditions. Jane witnessed firsthand the suffering of workers, particularly women and children, who were often subjected to long hours in dangerous, poorly regulated industries. She became an outspoken advocate for the rights of workers, pushing for legislation that would regulate working hours, improve workplace safety, and protect workers from exploitation. Jane's advocacy for child labour laws was a critical part of her work during this time. In the early 20th century, many children worked in factories, mills, and mines under hazardous conditions. Jane was one of the leading reformers who pushed for legislation that would restrict child labour, ensuring that children could receive an education rather than being sent to work in factories. Her efforts, combined with those of other social reformers, eventually led to the establishment of child labour laws in the United States, which became a cornerstone of the labour rights movement. In addition to her work in labour reform, Jane was a staunch advocate for women's suffrage, believing that women should have the right to vote and have an active role in shaping public policy. During the Progressive Era, the women's suffrage movement gained significant momentum, and Jane played a key role in this effort. She used her platform to speak out in favour of women's right to vote, and encouraged women to become involved in social and political causes. Jane believed that women's participation in public life was crucial to creating a more just and compassionate society, and she worked tirelessly to secure the vote for women. Jane also made significant contributions to the fight for better public health and education. She recognized that addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality required improving access to basic services like healthcare and education. Hull House, under Jane's leadership, became a place where immigrants and working-class families could access these vital services. She championed public health initiatives, including the establishment of healthcare clinics and educational programs for children and adults. She believed that education was a key factor in breaking the cycle of poverty, and that every person, regardless of their background, deserved access to the tools necessary to succeed. Jane's work in social reform was not just about addressing the symptoms of inequality, but also about pushing for systemic change. She worked to change public policy at the local, state, and national levels, advocating for laws that would protect workers, improve living conditions, and provide greater access to social services. She was particularly involved in the creation of social welfare programs, believing that it was the responsibility of the government to ensure that all citizens had access to the resources they needed to live with dignity and security. As the Progressive Era continued, Jane's influence grew, and she became one of the leading figures in the movement. She was not only a social reformer, but also a political activist, engaging with policymakers and using her voice to influence legislation. She worked alongside other prominent reformers, including Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, to push for progressive legislation that would improve the lives of ordinary Americans. Jane's commitment to social justice, her advocacy for the poor and marginalized, and her belief in the power of community-based social work made her one of the most important figures of the Progressive Era. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jane's work continued to resonate as the country faced new challenges, including the Great Depression and the rise of authoritarianism in Europe. Despite her declining health, Jane remained actively involved in social and political causes, continuing to push for reforms that would protect the rights of workers, women, and children. Her efforts to advocate for peace during the rise of fascism, and her work to address the economic devastation caused by the Depression, cemented her legacy as one of the most important social reformers of her time. As the 1930s unfolded, Jane Addams entered the final phase of her remarkable life. By this time, her contributions to social reform, peace advocacy, and the empowerment of women had already made her one of the most influential figures in American history. She had shaped the fields of social work, settlement house movements, labor rights, and peace advocacy, and her work had left an indelible mark on society. However, as the Great Depression continued to affect millions, and the world faced the looming threat of another global conflict, Jane Addams' health began to decline. In 1927, She suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Although this physical setback severely impacted her ability to continue her day-to-day activism, it did not diminish her determination to continue her work. Jane had always been a tireless worker, whether through her writing, public speeches, or direct work with the community, and she continued to remain intellectually engaged even when her health prevented her from fully participating in physical activities. Jane's resolve to continue her mission reflected her deep commitment to the causes she had championed for over 4 decades. Though physically weakened, Jane was still a prominent figure in the peace movement throughout the 1930s. Her concern about the increasing militarization in Europe and the rise of fascist regimes troubled her deeply. As she had done during World War I, she used her position to call for diplomacy over war, urging leaders to seek peaceful alternatives to conflict. As a pacifist, Jane saw the growing tension in Europe and the world as a direct challenge to the ideals of democracy and human rights that she had spent her life advocating for. The same ideals that had driven her peace efforts earlier in her career, international cooperation, mutual respect, and dialogue, remained at the core of her work in the 1930s. Even as her health deteriorated, Jane remained involved in promoting social welfare policies in the US, particularly in advocating for a stronger safety net for the poor and unemployed during the Great Depression. At Hull House, she had worked directly with Chicago's most vulnerable communities, and now, even in her later years, she continued to champion systemic changes that would address the root causes of poverty and inequality. Her unwavering belief that social programs should be expanded to serve those in need was echoed by other prominent reformers and political leaders of the time. During these years, Jane's influence was still felt in the social work community. Hull House continued to educate new generations of social workers, many of whom had been trained under Jane's leadership. Her vision of social work as an organized professional field had already helped establish social services as a respected career, and the profession continued to grow throughout the 1930s. She had laid the groundwork for the professionalization of social work, and the results of that work would be felt for decades to come. On the international stage, Jane continued to advocate for peace and diplomacy until her health no longer allowed her to do so. In 1931, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming the first American woman to receive the honor. The recognition was a reflection of the global respect she had earned for her tireless efforts to promote peace, equality, and justice. Jane's Nobel Prize was not just a personal achievement, it was a testament to the power of grassroots advocacy and the impact that individuals can have on the course of history. Her legacy of peace-building would inspire future generations of women, social workers and activists committed to promoting human rights and peace. Though Jane Addams' health continued to decline, her legacy lived on through her work, her writings, and the institutions she helped establish. Hull House remained a vital resource for Chicago's working-class and immigrant communities, continuing its mission of social reform well after Jane's death. Her work provided the blueprint for a social welfare system that would evolve throughout the 20th century, ultimately influencing the creation of national programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and Medicare. On May 21, 1935, Jane Addams passed away at the age of 74. The world mourned her death, but her influence continued to resonate long after she was gone. Her contributions to social work, her advocacy for women's rights, and her peace efforts had transformed not only the lives of those she worked with directly, but also the broader landscape of American social policy. Jane had demonstrated that compassion, activism, and systemic reform could lead to lasting change. As the years passed, the impact of Jane Addams' work was increasingly acknowledged. She had laid the groundwork for a more just and compassionate world, and her influence continued to shape the social justice movements of the 20th century. From the labor rights reforms she championed to the settlement house movement she pioneered, Jane's contributions continue to influence social work, peace-building, and women's rights advocacy today. Since Jane Addams' passing in 1935, her work has continued to resonate across multiple generations, shaping modern social work, peace-building, and progressive reform. Jane's emphasis on community-based social services, her advocacy for systemic change, and her profound belief in the dignity of every individual have become foundational principles in the field of social work. Though she worked during a time when the profession was still emerging, her vision for social work has influenced its development into a respected professional field. Her legacy lives on through the institutions she founded, the policies she advocated for, and the countless social workers and reformers who have carried forward her work. One of the most important aspects of Jane Addams' legacy is her pioneering role in establishing social work as a professional field. Through Hull House and the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, Jane advocated for a model of social work that combined practical service with academic study. She believed that social workers needed to be well versed in the social problems they sought to address, but also that they needed to understand the broader structural forces that contributed to inequality. By offering training to the next generation of social workers, Jane helped ensure that the profession would be built on principles of empathy, education, and systemic reform. Her approach to social work, which prioritized direct engagement with communities, laid the foundation for the community-based social work model we see today. Social workers are often at the forefront of efforts to tackle poverty, homelessness, mental health challenges, and child welfare, just as Jane was in her time. Today, Jane's belief in addressing root causes, rather than merely alleviating symptoms, continues to guide modern social work practice. As the social work profession continued to grow, Jane's influence remained a guiding force. By the mid-20th century, her advocacy for the professionalization of social work had helped shape the structure of social work programs and policies. Universities and training programs for social workers began to reflect the values that Jane had championed: an understanding of the broader social context, the importance of both theory and practice, and a commitment to improving the lives of individuals and communities through systemic change. Another significant aspect of Jane Addams' enduring legacy is her advocacy for women's rights and gender equality. As a leader in the women's suffrage movement, Jane played a key role in securing the right to vote for American women. However, her work extended far beyond suffrage. Jane believed that women had a crucial role to play in shaping both domestic and international policy, and she spent much of her life advocating for women's involvement in social reform and political decision-making. Today, Jane's work has influenced the ongoing fight for women's rights and gender equality, and her legacy continues to inspire women around the world. The modern feminist movement, which gained momentum in the 1960s and 1970s, built upon the foundations that Jane had laid. Her vision of an inclusive society where women could participate equally in public life has resonated with generations of women who've continued to push for political, economic, and social equality. In addition to her work on women's rights, Jane's legacy as a peace advocate has also had a lasting impact. Her pacifism and commitment to diplomacy during times of war have set a precedent for future peace builders. Jane's leadership in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and her advocacy for a peace without victory model influenced peace movements throughout the 20th century, particularly after the devastation of World War II. The principles Jane championed regarding peace-building, diplomacy, and international cooperation were central to the formation of the United Nations and continue to guide international relations today. Her focus on the importance of women's participation in global peace efforts helped to open doors for future female diplomats and peace negotiators. In a world that still grapples with conflict, Jane's vision of peaceful diplomacy remains a powerful reminder of the role women can play in shaping a more peaceful and just world. Moreover, Jane's work in labour rights, particularly her advocacy for child labour laws, fair wages and improved working conditions, has had a lasting effect on labour movements and workers' rights. She was instrumental in pushing for reforms that would lead to the establishment of labour protections and fair working conditions. Jane's commitment to social justice and the protection of workers remains an integral part of the modern labour rights movement, which continues to fight for fair wages, safe working conditions, and better labour laws worldwide. Even as her direct involvement in social work faded with the years, Jane Addams' influence remained a guiding force in shaping American social policy. Her belief in the interconnectedness of peace, social justice, and systemic change continued to inspire activists and policymakers who worked to expand the social safety net during the New Deal and beyond. Programs that expanded healthcare, housing, and employment benefits for marginalized communities were influenced by Jane's lifelong advocacy for a more compassionate and equitable society. In the decades following her death, Jane's contributions to social welfare, peace, women's rights, and labour reform were increasingly recognized. She remains a symbol of the power of grassroots activism to bring about meaningful change. Jane's life is a testament to the power of compassion and conviction, showing how one person can inspire lasting change through dedication to justice, equality, and the well-being of all people. Jane Addams' life and work have left an indelible mark on American society and the world. She was a visionary social reformer who combined practical social services with deep intellectual inquiry, creating a legacy that continues to inspire those who seek justice, equality, and peace. From her pioneering work with Hull House and the Settlement House movement to her tireless advocacy for labour rights, women's suffrage, and global peace, Jane's impact spans far beyond her lifetime. In her early years, Jane was driven by an acute sense of moral responsibility, shaped by her personal experiences, social environment, and academic studies. She saw firsthand the devastating effects of poverty, inequality, and the challenges faced by immigrant communities. This sparked her desire to create a space where these communities could not only survive but thrive. Hull House became the living embodiment of her belief in the power of mutual respect, community action, and education. Her role in the professionalization of social work was groundbreaking. By creating the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, she formalized social work as a field that required both rigorous training and deep empathy. Hull House became a hub for social work education, and through it, Jane helped shape the careers of many who went on to make significant contributions to social reform. Her belief that social workers should be as well trained as they were compassionate became the foundation for how social work is practiced today. In the area of women's rights, Jane Addams was a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, economic independence, and participation in public life. She understood that empowering women was key to building a just society. Her work provided a model for future generations of women activists, and her tireless support of women's rights has had a profound impact on the feminist movements that followed. Her vision of a society where women were equal partners in social, political, and economic life continues to resonate today. As an advocate for global peace, Jane's contributions are no less significant. Her pacifism and tireless efforts to prevent war, particularly during World War I, set a high standard for how individuals and organizations can work toward diplomacy and cooperation, rather than military conflict. Her work with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and her support of international disarmament laid the foundation for the modern peace movements and the formation of institutions like the United Nations. Her legacy is also intertwined with the rise of the welfare state in the US, particularly through her advocacy for social services for marginalized communities. Jane Addams' commitment to advocating for labor laws, child welfare, and the needs of the poor helped pave the way for social welfare policies like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and Medicare. Her belief that the government should play an active role in providing for its citizens' well-being is a principle that continues to guide social policy today. What makes Jane Addams's legacy so enduring is the combination of her head and her heart. She was a thinker who was deeply committed to understanding the root causes of social problems, but she was also a doer who believed in the power of direct action. Her work in social reform was not theoretical. It was about addressing the real-world needs of individuals and communities. Her approach to social work was grounded in both the intellectual and the practical, an approach that is still at the heart of modern social services today. Jane's life was marked by a deep sense of moral duty, a commitment to fairness, and an unwavering belief in the power of individuals and communities to create change. Her tireless efforts to address the root causes of social injustice, whether through social work, women's rights advocacy, or peace building, continue to resonate with those who work for a more just and compassionate world. Today, her ideas about social justice, community-based action, and the power of diplomacy in global relations remain central to how we address issues of poverty, inequality, and conflict. As we reflect on Jane Addams' life, we're reminded of her call to action, that social reform requires both empathy and intellectual rigor, that peace is possible through cooperation rather than conflict, and that we're all responsible for the well-being of others. Her legacy serves as a powerful reminder that one person's commitment to justice and equality can change the course of history and create a more just and compassionate world for future generations. Jane Addams' extraordinary life was dedicated to one simple but powerful goal: to create a world where the most vulnerable could live with dignity and equality. Through her tireless work at Hull House, her advocacy for labour rights and women's suffrage, her commitment to global peace, and her deep belief in the transformative power of social work, Jane shaped the future of social reform. Her impact continues to be felt today, not only in the profession she helped establish, but also in the lasting principles she instilled in those who followed her path. Her life is a testament to the idea that change is possible through compassion, education, and collective action. In the work of social workers, activists, and advocates today, Jane Addams' spirit continues to guide the way toward a more just, peaceful, and equitable world. Her legacy is not just a chapter in history. It is a living, ongoing influence that shapes our world today, and will continue to do so for generations to come. Thank you for journeying through the life and legacy of Jane Addams, a pioneer of social reform, a fierce advocate for peace, and a champion for justice. May her work inspire all of us to continue the fight for a better, fairer world.